So, hello, I think it's time to start. So, welcome to the expert panel, and thank you for being here. The expert panel aims to discuss the current issues and future directions, as the title shows, in the fields of motivation and emotion, different theoretical aspects, as well as different and new methods that would allow us to better measure motivational constructs and refine existing theories in the field will be discussed. Independently of different approaches, the aim always remains the same: to understand student motivation and emotion better and more reliably in order to enhance it and have more engaged to the process of learning students. I would like to express my thanks to our distinguished panelists, Reinhard Pekron, Anne Renninger, Gail Sinatra, Julie Turner, and Tim Erdan, and Martin van Stikiste for their positive response to my invitation and for the great collaboration we had while preparing the panel. However, Martin, unfortunately, had to leave earlier, but you are encouraged, of course, to read his recent paper in collaboration with Thanasis Moratidis on emerging trends and future directions in motivation research in the special issue for Willy Lenz. But since Martin is not here, he sent us the 4 key points in this article, so I would like to show them. No, this is not. Ποιο είναι το...
Νομίζω είναι αυτό που είσαι προηγουμένως στα δύο.
Αυτό.
F5.
Okay, so I was talking about this article by Martin and Thanasis in the special issue for Willy Lenz. So let's see the four key actions that Martin and Thanasis discuss about the emerging trends and future directions in the field of motivation. So Martin suggests that we should turn to multi-perspectivism. We are all aware of his attempts to bridge achievement goal theory and self-determination theory, and then we should rely on multi-frameworks. They also suggest diversity of motives and goals that contextualize behavior. We should also look for motives for non-participation. And also, they raise the issue about universalism versus relativism. So the question is whether there are universal processes or whether the processes are dependent on socio-demographic, personality-based, and contextual factors. But I really encourage you to read the paper. The paper is, I think, in an open access journal, so all of you can find it easily. So we are going on with our expert panel with those who are here. So when planning this panel, I thought that in addition to our distinguished experts, it would be interesting to involve real students and teachers' voice in the panel. So for this purpose, 3 secondary school students and 3 teachers, obviously highly motivated, share their beliefs about school in a video that we will see in a few seconds. Of course, we should have in our mind the limitation that the participant students and teachers are only those who accepted to talk in English for this video. And as we all know, the ones who usually accept to participate in such activities are those who care about what they are doing and try to improve themselves. Moreover, they are all Greek, so what they say represents a particular educational context, which is not the best in terms of educational outcomes, as we all know, if we take into account the international evaluations, but this probably makes it even more useful for our purpose. So before starting, I would like to thank all the video participants for their contribution to this panel. And special thanks are also due to Stuart Karabenik, Yota Metalidou, Irini Dermidjaki, and Angeliki Leondari for drafting the video questions. So let's start then and enjoy the video. Dimitri, the video? You were supposed to be here, you know.
I was here.
He's all everywhere, yeah.
Okay.
What do you like most at school?
Fuck.
I like the friendly environment and the nice approach the teachers have to the children.
So what I like most at school, except from being with my friends and having fun,
Technical. We'll fix it. F4.
Actually, it was, we heard yesterday Mark talking about students who don't like school. So we're going to what they don't like most at school.
What do you like most?
Θα τεστάρει απλά τώρα τι έγινε. Να αλλάξουμε τις ρυθμίσεις, να φαίνεται ότι
What do you like most at school?
προκειμένου...
I like the friendly environment and the nice approach the teachers have to the children.
so what I like most at school, except from being with my friends and having fun,
Κάτσε, ελαχιστοποίηση. Τι φάση αυτή η οθόνη.
Έλατε, θα το κάνω να το κλείσω.
Έχει μεγαλώσει πολύ η οθόνη, ναι, κάτσε. Λοιπόν, θα βάλουμε.
Ωραία. Ωραία.
Θα κάνουμε duplicate.
Duplicate, μπράβο. Ωραία.
Τι σημαίνει revert?
Keep. Ας βάλουμε keep και βλέπουμε.
Μια στιγμή να δούμε τώρα. Α, τώρα
Ωραία.
έγινε.
Δείξω.
Αυτό είναι. Αυτό είναι το δεύτερο.
What do you like most at school?
I like the friendly environment and the nice approach the teachers have to the children.
so what I like most at school, except from being with my friends and having fun, is that it provides me the knowledge I need and that I can learn something new every day about lots of different subjects.
What I like most is the social role of the school. The fact that you're surrounded by so many different people, having the opportunity to exchange ideas and argue with them.
What is the most interesting thing at school?
Music projects we prepare with the bands we belong to, which are always followed by an educational trip.
The most interesting thing I found about school is that it is a small model of the society. Children at school face almost every possible situation that we'll face some years later as grown-ups, and I think it's the best way to prepare themselves.
The most interesting thing at school is that it offers a variety of learning subjects from which you choose those you like most in order to follow them in the future.
What is the most boring thing at school?
The fact that we have to attend mandatory classes with subjects we do not like and we are not willing to study for.
And the most boring thing about school is when a teacher is uninterested in his own subject and teaches it in a very monotonous way.
First, the duration of the school program in Greece, which lasts from 8 o'clock up to 2 o'clock, is very tiring and boring. Second, the teaching methods of some teachers, for example, when they do not actively engage the students into the class.
What are the first three things you would change at school?
I would change the beginning of the lesson hours because it is way too early in the morning. I think we should also pick the lessons we are taught and we should make some decisions that affect our educational career later on.
First of all, I would change the environment of the school. I would make it more friendly to the students because they spend a lot of time in the school, so I think the environment must inspire them. Second of all, I would change the way of teaching. I would like it to be more interesting and experiential. And third of all, I would change some of the teachers because it seems like they don't like what they're doing. and it is obvious to the students and to their work, so I find it nonsense to do something that they don't find any interest in it.
The school facilities should be more friendly to the students, some of the teachers must be replaced, and the school program should become more flexible, while the students should be given more choices.
What are the most important attributes about the teacher you like?
I would like my teacher to be passionate, enthusiastic, but not so strict.
The most important thing I want about a teacher is to like what he does, to be friendly, and to know each and every student, know their weaknesses, their strong points, and be able to inspire them and bring out the best of them.
First, teachers should be able to communicate their knowledge to the students by explaining the material well, catching their attention, and sharing with them their enthusiasm about knowledge. Second, the teachers should be supportive to all students, not only in academic issues, but also in personal and social issues.
What do you do in everyday teaching to motivate students and for them to become further engaged in school learning?
I try them to have a primary role in my class by encouraging them to search for knowledge, to think, argue, take responsibilities, collaborate and communicate with one another while respecting rules at the same time. In addition, I use various instructional practices responding to my students' needs as well as to their interests and to do things that matter for them, are meaningful and have to do with their everyday life. I also make extensive use of new technologies as well as artistic activities such as fine arts, theatre, movies, and so on. Last but not least, I try to make them feel safe and comfortable in the class, feel free to express themselves and feel competent to success in school tasks. If they don't feel competent, they won't participate in any activity.
To begin with, I try hard to make my lessons structured and planned in such a way that everyone is included and can participate. Together with my students, we put up posters in our classroom, which for example refer to student goals or difficult concepts. I do my best to encourage and praise my students by using positive reinforcement, stickers and enthusiasm, and I try to make the lesson interesting by relating it to everyday life. I place emphasis on student improvement and I try to offer incentives like extra marks for additional work. For example, if a student reads and presents a book to the class. Towards the end of the lesson, as a reward, we play educational interactive games or I show relevant educational videos. The physical and intellectual classroom should never be boring.
So what I do in my everyday class to motivate my students, one thing is to amaze them with applications of mathematics in their everyday life. Another thing is that I try to include gamification in the lesson. I also write an overview of the lesson every day on the board so that they can keep on track and stay focused. And I also try to have them cooperate with each other when they solve an exercise.
Which are the first three things you would change at school?
First, more project-related schoolwork which promotes student autonomy and thinking in building their own knowledge and skills. Second, less typical evaluation based on tests and grades. Third, I would encourage parents' involvement in their children's school life.
First of all, I would like to have smart boards and more resources in every classroom. Secondly, I would like to see more collaboration between mainstream and special education teachers, parents, the principal, and state school advisors. We need to get past the territorial ideas we have about our classrooms and put our students' best interests first. Third, I would hope for better professional development and ongoing training for all teachers, including the latest on school psychology, teaching and motivational strategies, and special needs.
First of all, I would like to stress the importance of that motivation plays in student learning, so that the teachers should invest more time in the beginning of the year and also in the everyday class in order to motivate students and to open up them in the new knowledge they will receive. Another thing is to have the teachers cooperate more close to each other for example, entering the class of the other and see the lesson from another perspective. And also to have more group work among the students, because cooperation is a soft skill that is very crucial for somebody's life, so that they have to learn it from their school years.
Suppose that your students have the opportunity to change 3 things at their school. What do you think your students would choose to change?
1. A safer and happier school, because learning should be fun and more time for sports and play. 2. More out-of-school visits for entertainment purposes, not only for educational ones. 3. School should start later in the day, not at 8 a.m., and there should be more time for breaks.
3 things that students of mine have told me they would like to change at my school are changing the books and the curriculum and making both more interesting and up-to-date, having more interactive teachers who are both polite and understanding, and of course, having less homework and starting later than 8:15 a.m.
The first thing I think is more learning through playing. Also, they would like less homework, and moreover, they would like to take the lesson out of the class, which I have done it a couple of times with a lot of success.
What do you think students expect from the teacher they like?
A smiling, fair and unbiased teacher, a teacher who cares for them and for what they learn, listens to them and to their needs. A teacher who reinforces them, lets them express themselves and inspires them to move forward.
I think students expect us teachers to be inspirational and interesting, respectful, fair, polite, understanding, helpful, well-organized and knowledgeable, modern regarding the use of technology and teaching methods, fun and funny.
One is actually the first I think is that he takes care of them, that he shows interest, and he really cares about his students and their learning, so that it also changes their attitude to their learning. Moreover, they want him to be, of course, to have knowledge, very good knowledge of his subject in order to trust them. And also they want him to be able to motivate them, to give life to the lesson and give them reasons to come to the class every day for a whole year.
So Anne will be the first one starting the panel discussion.
Right. Yesterday we all met as a group and sort of organized our comments. So there's a way in which this sort of starts. And one of the things that I found yesterday in Marcu's talk was that I felt like he had already started this conversation for us. As I watched the videos, which we received about a month ago, one of the things that occurred to me was how sort of they echoed a lot of the data that I had been collecting. And so I study interest and had a study of high school kids that I thought it might actually be interesting for you to just see a smattering of the data, and then I'll comment on where I think the possible implications are for going forward. This is data from a short longitudinal study of working class middle and high school students. And we had a lot of data that were available to us. But one of the things that's particularly interesting in light of the questions about how much do you like school, what do you think needs to go on, is to really think about, like, sort of how are they engaging the subjects that they're in. The particular study that I'm drawing on was one that was undertaken in collaboration with a school district that was really concerned about its students' engagement in science. And so that was what we were targeting specifically, but we actually collected data from the students across the different disciplines that they were taking. And in this figure, I'm going to actually, just so that you can see it, I'm going to flip through 6th grade, 9th grade, 12th grade, and I suggest that you watch the second column because that happens to be science, and it's one of the reasons that the practitioners in the school were actually concerned. So this is 6th grade, and then you see 9th grade, and then you see 12th grade. So the students are also, other things to have possibly noticed in that graph is that students are not disengaged in the same way in all of their subjects. I think this is something that's really critical. In the last session we were talking about utility value interventions and sort of how it's possible to target and support kids to change. Interest is definitely malleable, and it's something that, you know, it's worth thinking about in terms of going forward. What we also learned from the interview data, however, so this is a cascading kind of study, so we not only had surveys, but we also have interview, and then we actually worked up case material. I'm really just picking things out, is that when they were asked about science, many of the students spoke about science or liking science, but their referent was not science as the discipline they were supposed to be learning, but the teacher, the activity, or the others in the class. In other words, the context, right? And that's what they were engaging as science and whether they liked it or not. And the other thing that we learned was that all but one student who was interviewed described science content on which they would like to focus in their classes and mentioned that they would like opportunities to go into more depth. The one student who actually didn't, okay, so we're talking about 300, close to 400 students. They all had things they wanted to learn. So despite the dropping rates, had a less developed interest in science. So, you know, that actually would be completely expected. As to describe the classroom activity, all students in 5th grade, which happened to focus on project-based work, describe concepts. This is only true of students with more developed interest at other grades. And following 8th grade, we found that the student interviews indicated the importance of achievement in school. Students with more developed interests do not mention grades. They talk about what they're doing in school, and they're clearly engaged in that word, in that sense. Those with less developed interest, on the other hand, only talk about grades, having to do well. This is a working class neighborhood. Most of the kids are coming from families where parents have not gone to college, but they know that going to college is really essential, and there's a lot of pressure to succeed, but there's not necessarily the kind of support that needs to be in place in order to make that possible. So then what we did was we went in and we took sort of cases of students to look sort of even more closely at what was going on. And here I'm just reporting on 2 8th grade students who were matched on achievement scores and also their work with Project 2061 tasks the year before. And the 2061 tasks we used as sort of a counter to what it was that the Achievement Index was going to show us. And what we find is that Chris, a pseudonym, is impatient with the lectures that engage Kara. So we've got 2 students in the same class, and they're having really different experiences. Chris doesn't even find hands-on activities interesting because they're about procedures and not about science. Kara talks about the hands-on activities, developing their knowledge of procedures so that they can actually go on and do more science. They both talk about a dull lecture in the class. They both get that this person just goes on and on and on. However, Chris sees it as hopeless. He's not interested in doing any more work and certainly doesn't want to stay after school to find out what it is that he could also do. On the other hand, Kara talks about all the information the teacher has and how fortunate they are to have somebody with that much knowledge. So the difference in perception really sets them up to actually make differences in accomplishment in their classes and also subsequently in school. I think there's good evidence that interest is malleable now. I'm not going to go through that. And the other thing that's important is that it can be supported to develop at any age and in any context. If we went back to those bar graphs, one of the things that's interesting is that in some of the subject areas, it goes up and sometimes it goes down. And I think that's a lot of the function of what the curricular context is, which we heard in the video. We also hear that in a lot of the data that were presented at this conference. We also think that it's really not a paradox that interest declines as subject matter gets more difficult. Okay, even though it seems to be, and Suzanne and I talk about that in our book, really the development of interest involves work to support an understanding of content so that the learner finds it rewarding. So that's whether you're organizing the tasks or you're thinking about the way that you're scaffolding the kinds of interactions that you're having with a student. It's a process. It's one that goes on. Even the person with more developed interests needs to continue to be challenged, or interests will fall off and they will not be positioned to really learn in the same way. So what does this actually suggest to us about sort of where we need to go with our research? You know, certainly this is one way of sort of construing the research possibilities, but I think about multiple data sources and methods as being essential. You know, when I collect survey data, I get one lens. When I actually go in and look at kids' artifacts, or I, you know, have interviews and am able to like work through and look at cases more closely, it gives me a sense of what it is that I'm working with and also what still needs to be done. This was an effort, as I said, that was a collaboration with practitioners in a school district. They really wanted to know what they could do to change. And so coming up with the cases was probably the most useful. They sort of, even though they're science people, blur over on the data. They can understand a bar chart, but what they need is the stories, they need the context, they need the feedback that actually helps them to think about making change. I also think that working with practitioners, and so this is my sort of contribution going forward, is that working with practitioners' questions, you know, if we actually hear their questions, we can always answer our own questions also, but by working with the questions, it's a way to support their professional development because you come back to them with the answers to the questions that they've posed. Those they actually will pay attention to, and those data they're really interested in. You know, when I sit down with the chemistry department and say, it's really interesting to me, you know, that we're seeing this kind of change. Can you explain it to me? They look at it really hard because it's their department and they're really interested in the questions that they posed. But I also think that another advantage of doing work with practitioners, it takes a lot of time and patience. Sometimes you don't speak the same language. Those things you have to deal with. But it's a way to ground basic research and motivation. I think it's really essential for us to step back from the programmatic work that we've done and to actually think about, well, does it work in practice? Are the variables too large? Is aggregating data actually useful to the practitioner, or do we actually need to break it out in some way? And I think it will also end up strengthening our theory building and modeling. I know that at least in the work that I've done in interest research, that it really feels like that's been the case. And then finally, I didn't want to overlook the importance of dissemination to practice. I think that we as a motivation community have a huge amount to contribute to practice and policy, as Marku pointed out. I think the problem is that we have a language, it's not Spanish, but it's a language that actually makes it very difficult for other people to parse. And we work with data and pictures and figures and things that make meaning for us, and we use terms that are not necessarily everyday terms. And so thinking about how we can actually go back to practice is important, especially if we want to change things and have people be able to work with them. Julie is actually following, and she's picking up and sort of taking a dive a little bit deeper into the role of context.
Thank you, Anne. It's almost like she set me up so perfectly. So I have to figure out whether I need glasses or not. So first of all, I'd like to thank Eleftheria for inviting me and all of us to be part of this wonderful group of scholars, you included. I'd like to focus on two main issues that Anne has brought up and that have emerged from my work over the years, and I think they need further attention in motivation research. The first is the need to understand the role of context in motivation to learn, surprise, surprise. And the second one is related, and that is if we are to make an impact, we need to work with teachers as partners. So on the first issue, we need to know more about the how and why of motivation to learn. We've been quite successful in measuring student self-perceptions, but how and why these perceptions develop is still very much a black box in motivation research. This situation suggests that we take the study of settings or contexts in which people learn as a serious goal in motivation research. I turned that on by mistake. Okay. Why do we need to know more about the context of learning? Think of the complexity of even the most, of even the most ordinary classroom. First, each student is unique. Each has different preferences and abilities to interact with others, both with peers and with the teacher. Consider that some students have been cast into roles that either advantage or disadvantage them in terms of motivation and learning. Maybe they fit in or maybe they don't. Maybe they fit in one class or in one space, and maybe they don't in another. What do their classroom norms allow or promote or discourage? What is valued academically and socially in the context in which they participate? What opportunities are offered, and are they offered to all or to just some students? Who has power or status, and how does that play out in their motivation to learn? Now think about the teacher. What are his or her goals? How does the teacher define learning? What does the teacher think is good instruction? And what responsibility does the teacher take for student learning and motivation? What is the curriculum like? And we heard all this in the students' comments in the video. What is the curriculum like? And how do students interact with it? So, as I referred to the video, students consistently mentioned, and teachers did too, some of them, that instruction should be interesting. What does that mean? Does that mean a different thing to every single person who spoke about it? We don't. Anne's done a ton of this. I don't know if she could answer that question. Maybe she will later. Okay. Now, think about the organizational culture in the school and national education policy. How might these interact with student motivation and teacher motivation and instruction? How might they affect the curriculum? To take the case in the US, in the past 15 years, the educational policy has emphasized more and more standardized testing for students and the use of that testing in evaluating teachers. How has this policy environment influenced student and teacher motivation? Finally, let's remember that all these components interact continuously. However one chooses to study these interacting components, they are important in students' motivation, and we must do a better job of understanding their impact if we are to make progress in motivation research. Now to my second point. I believe we should invite teachers to join us in investigating motivation to learn. As much as I love the intellectual stimulation I experience when I interact with my colleagues in settings like this one, at the end of the day, I ask myself, what good is our research if it doesn't make a difference in the lives of teachers and students? My work with teachers has been both the most challenging and the most rewarding that I have done. One thing I have learned is that many teachers are intuitive motivators, but they do not have the language to describe what they do. And they often don't know why their strategies are effective or ineffective. Some believe that motivation is the student's responsibility, not theirs. Some teachers have few ideas about motivation beyond reward and punishment. This suggests that if teachers could learn what engages students and why, they could be more effective. Moreover, They would have the tools to analyze situations in their classrooms, and they might also be able to help their less successful peers. This is easier said than done. I have learned how difficult, and Anne mentioned this, I've learned how difficult it is to communicate to teachers the ideas that we take for granted. Let me give you an example. A few years ago, a principal asked us to work with the teachers in her middle school because they complained, and I hear this everywhere, that our students aren't motivated. Our approach was to start by explaining that good instruction is motivating. We then defined good instruction as instruction that supported students' competence, autonomy, relatedness, and that was meaningful or relevant to them. That's familiar to you. All right. We defined these motivational principles. We gave examples of instructional strategies that could be aligned with the motivational principles, but even then, the motivation constructs were quite difficult for the teachers to grasp. It was a new way of thinking for them. One teacher said, "What does it mean that something is meaningful to kids?" It's an 8th grade history teacher. Another teacher revealed that she had not gotten her brain wrapped around the concept of student autonomy. But we eat that for breakfast, right? But they don't. Okay. This is partly because we come from different worlds. Ours is abstract and conceptual. Theirs is concrete and really focused on individual differences. How can we bring our worlds together? One way is simply by spending time together. Because we had the privilege of spending 3 years at this school, we were able to revisit these ideas frequently with teachers. And when we did, we could see that teachers were gaining more and more understanding. For example, one science teacher complained that her students weren't completing homework, they weren't interested in anything she taught. And I was in that classroom, and that is true. We suggested that formative assessment practices might engage students more in their learning because it could increase students' feelings of competence. So she took us up on that. She began with simple activities such as asking students true and false questions about volcanoes, and that aroused, a simple thing aroused their interest, and they really wanted to know if their answers were right or wrong, and they wanted to know why. So she was encouraged then that students wanted to find out about their answers. And as she continued these opportunities for students to increase competence and autonomy, the students started to make decisions about their own learning and to demonstrate more ownership. Now, this isn't just a miracle case. This teacher was one of the most ineffective we worked with in the school. And so it was a pretty wonderful thing to happen. So as we followed her into a second year, we noticed that her instruction really did change from teacher to student-centered. And as she observed the changes in her students, then she began to develop an understanding of what constructs like competence meant and how they support motivation. Our definitions didn't do it. She had to make a change, and she had to see it in action. So by giving teachers tools to change their instruction and allowing them to see their students change, we found that teachers began both to understand motivational constructs and to make these their own. So I've also learned from teachers. I've watched some masterful teachers establish rapport with their students and then build on that relationship to engage them in meaningful academic work. I watched as a teacher helped her class to show respect to a student struggling to make a point. These experiences have made me a better researcher because I have a clearer understanding of what teachers want to know, how they think, and what hampers or supports our communication and collaboration. And they have further strengthened my belief that, in the end, if we don't have an effect in classrooms, we haven't accomplished enough. Thanks.
Thank you, Julie. So Reinhard will continue. Oh, yes. Yours is this one. No, it's, where is yours?
No. It's not open, maybe? Let's open it.
This one. Okay, that's it.
So first of all, I would like to thank Eleftheria for the invitation to contribute to this panel and for sharing this inspiring video in the beginning. Research on motivation and emotion, where are we and where should we go from here? I think we have made substantial progress over the past 20 years. This is true for research on interest, it's true for research on the classroom context, it's also true for research on emotions. Until 20 years ago, emotions were just disregarded by educational research. 20 years ago, we had knowledge about just one specific emotion, and that was students' test anxiety. Knowledge about test anxiety had accumulated since the 1950s. The findings were documented in meta-analyses, so that's a solid body of research, but our knowledge was just really confined to this one single emotion. We knew next to nothing 20 years ago about students' emotions other than anxiety, their enjoyment of learning, their pride, their shame, their hopes, their anger, their boredom, and we also knew next to nothing about teachers' emotions. This has changed dramatically over the past 20 years. There's a growing number of studies on the multiple positive and negative emotions experienced by students and teachers. A number of intervention projects have just recently been launched targeting students' emotions, and this year the first meta-analysis on students' boredom has been published. So there is progress across fields, I would say, in motivation and emotion, but there also are challenges, and let me just mention five issues. Development of theory, research on motivation and emotion, I would say, is in a fragmented state today. In the early and middle centuries of the 20th century, there were authors who provided us with comprehensive theoretical frameworks, Kurt Lewin, Gordon Allport, Raymond Cattell, and so on. Today, we experience a proliferation of mini-theories and small constructs, which impedes communication between us researchers, but also impedes our communication with practitioners and policymakers. And yesterday's symposium on engagement made this very clear, that we are not in a really good shape in that respect. We need to reach better consensus on how to define constructs. We need to overcome the jingle-jangle fallacies that are typical for the field, using different names for one and the same construct and using one and the same name for different constructs. If we ask motivation researchers what is an achievement goal, this seems to be a clearly delineated construct, but we get at least two completely different answers. If we ask interest researchers what is interest, and you have your answer, but there are other answers as well. If we ask emotion scientists, for example, what is mood, and is mood different from emotion? Is confusion an emotion? Are fear and anxiety the same? Same picture, multiple answers that are not compatible. Based on different definitions for one and the same construct, it's not possible to build a cumulative science of motivation and emotion, and this also contributes to these difficulties we are having in communicating with practitioners. Just too many voices from our side, too many different perspectives, too many terms. And we also need to better integrate existing theories on motivation and emotion. I think that should be possible. Many of our theories, I would say, are complementary and not mutually exclusive. For example, main propositions of expectancy value theory, control value theory, interest theory, and self-determination theory could easily be integrated. Expectancy value and control value theory are complementary in explaining the cognitive determinants of motivation, expectancy value, and emotion, control value theory. Self-determination theory, interest theory explain how values come about. So it should be possible to better integrate these various frameworks. Second issue is facets of motivation and emotion. We are still very much focused on examining motivation and emotion from an achievement-related perspective. In the interviews that were depicted in that video, the students made very clear to what extent their motivation at school is directed towards other persons and how important social interaction is for their development. Vasiliki put this very nicely. What is most interesting about school? Her answer was, school is a small model of society. At school we can learn how to enact social roles, which prepares us for our life as grown-ups. So I think we should pay more attention to social motivation and social emotions. There have been 2 symposia at this conference on motivation and emotion, collaborative group-based learning that steps in that direction. We are also still very much focused on examining motivation as a static and trait-like phenomenon measured once, maybe twice or 3 times in longitudinal designs. We need more research than really capturing the dynamic. We talk about that all the time over, but few of us are really doing that, capturing the dynamic and situated nature of motivation. And we need to better integrate our perspectives on motivation and emotion in students on the one hand and in their teachers on the other hand. The student answers in the video, in the interviews, made clear to what extent their motivation and emotion are intertwined with teachers' enthusiasm or lack of enthusiasm. So we need to study the processes of emotional contagion that promote or undermine the engagement of both teachers and students in the classroom. Methodology, measurement, we are still very much focused on using self-report. I would say we need to continue using self-report. It's a primary method to assess motivation and emotion. Self-report is indispensable for any more nuanced assessment of emotional and motivational thoughts. But on the other hand, self-report cannot be used to assess unconscious emotions and motives. It depends on the semantic meaning of words. It's subject to various bias. So I would agree with Anne that we really need multiple methods. We need to complement self-report with alternative methods. Implicit measures, which currently experience a revival in motivation science, are not yet used in our field. Newer scientific methodology, not suited to discriminate between different discrete emotions, but well suited to examine mediating processes and interactions with cognition. Analysis of peripheral physiological processes, observation of expression and gaze behavior, and so on. And each of these single methodological approaches is having its weaknesses. Each one of them is either lacking sensitivity or specificity, but as a collective toolkit, it should be quite powerful to use multiple methods. Analytical designs, we are still very much focused on using between-person designs in both experimental and field-based research. However, our ultimate goal, obviously, is to understand motivation and emotion in the single student or single teacher, and most of our theories also pertain to affective processes within the individual. To understand the individual and test our theories, we need to make more use of idiographic within-person approaches. From between-person variation, we cannot infer any valid conclusion that would be valid for the single individual. And one main reason is, from a quantitative perspective, that between-person and within-person covariation of variables are statistically independent, except for cases of ergodicity. But that's rare cases. Homogeneity of relations across individuals and stationarity of relations over time, this combination is just pretty rare. And here you see an example that I borrowed from Bernhard Schmitz. That's published more than 20 years ago in JPSP 93, and it's from medicine. And it depicts the relation between individuals' duration of sleep and their frequency of migraine headaches. And what you see is across individuals, the relation is a positive one. So this seems to suggest sleeping in leads to headaches. All what you need to do is getting up early. But within persons, the relation is a negative one. Short sleep precipitates headaches, and the practical consequences are just completely different. Now, the challenge is how to combine idiographic within-person and nomothetic between-person strategies in such a way that we can explain single students and teachers, but also create more general theories that hold for many students and teachers and that can be used for communicating with practitioners. And I think the best and maybe only way to do that is, as a first step, to investigate motivation within single individuals, and then in a second step, examining the functional homogeneity across individuals to create more general theories. And there were two symposia, one symposium yesterday on experience sampling methodology using for within-person analysis that provided steps in this direction. Intervention. Over the past decades, there where there has been an impressive development in terms of developing successful motivation intervention treatments, such as attribution retraining, targeting students' sense of control, and utility value intervention, targeting students' values. Much of this research has focused on helping university students or high school students to improve their motivation. We need to expand this, I would say, in two ways. First, how can we enhance motivation in younger students? How can we enhance motivation in preschool and early elementary school when the foundations for later motivation trajectories are laid? And second, what about emotion? How can we help students to develop adaptive emotions and prevent or reduce maladaptive emotions at school? Maybe social emotional learning programs could be adapted for doing this. Some of these programs have been generally successful. They do not target emotions at school specifically. Maybe principle of existing motivation interventions could be used, but this is not a trivial issue either. In the preceding symposium, we just talked about the possibility that boosting students' values could also boost both their positive, but then also maybe their negative emotions in terms of worries about their future. Finally, interdisciplinary collaboration and motivation research beyond the classroom. We are still very much focused on the individual student and the individual teacher. When we dare to transcend the individual, we consider interactions in the classroom, or we run two-level studies. This continues to be important, of course. I fully agree with you, Julie. However, education is having more than two levels. We need to also consider the broader context of education. And this affords interdisciplinary work, I would say. For example, what is the impact of the growing amount of social inequality within societies and across societies today on students' emotions, their motivation, their education aspirations, their life trajectories? Judy Rakovich talked about the social class achievement gap this morning. Now, this is a problem that typically is considered by economists and sociologists. We largely neglect these broader issues. I think we should seek more collaboration with colleagues from economy, sociology, political science, and so on. They typically do not attend our conferences, early ARA. They are a rare species, and we do not attend their conferences. There's a huge gap in communication between the different disciplines, considering different levels of our education systems, and we could contribute to changing this. My impression overall also is that we are not particularly successful in changing education that is practiced today in schools, universities, at the workplace. There are not many practitioners that really listen to us. There are not many policymakers who listen. To make a bigger impact, I think we need to do better in building a cumulative science that produces consistent findings which can be communicated in consistent ways. And we also just need more collaboration with other disciplines. Thank you.
Thank you, Reinhard. So, Tim Stern. Tim, the floor is yours.
Hello. I find it very difficult to sit for an hour or an hour and a half. I also find it very personally painful to look out and see people falling asleep. So, if you might want to just stand up and kind of stretch for a little bit to re-energize yourself. I do this with my classes all the time. So take a moment while I get my thing together.
Is it open? Άνοιξε το αυτό. Άνοιξε το... Εδώ. Tim, what an idea. It's this one.
Yes.
Expert panel, Erden. Okay. It was not open.
But don't leave. Just stand, don't leave.
A way to increase their motivation to attend this.
Okay, so they'll sit as I start to drone on. So in the video that we saw, I think all of the students said they didn't like homework, and had I been interviewed in high school, that's what I would have said too. But I didn't really mind homework because my way of coping with it was just to ignore the instructions and do what I wanted. And so that's what I did today. Mine is quite different. So my title, 3 humble suggestions for the future of motivation research. I don't know. I mean, what do I know, really? So kind of an immodest title, but here's 3 ideas. I won't talk about the last one much, just to save a little bit of time. So the 3 suggestions are this. Let's focus on behavior. Let's see what people actually do. A lot of our research focuses on what people say, which is good, and we've learned a lot from it. But sometimes we get a little bit enamored with correlating what people say with other things that they say, and lose sight of, well, what do they actually do? And I think that we know people often do different things than what they say. So let's look and see what they do. Pay attention to the atypical. We've got a little bit of an infatuation with the mean, and often the people that aren't in the mean, there's interesting stuff going on with them, so let's look at them. And the third one is recognize the importance of non-conscious processes, which Reinhard mentioned, so I'll skip that one. Okay, I just want to give you a little bit of an example of why it's important to pay attention to the differences between what people say and what people do. And I know this graph is hard to read from there, so I'll just describe what it says. There's an internet site, an internet dating site called OkCupid. And a guy who works at OkCupid mined the data and published a book. And it's fascinating. It's disturbing, but it's fascinating. So one of the things you can do on OkCupid is you can look at pictures of different people in the dating site and you can click on whether you like them. You know, like on Facebook or Instagram, you can just decide whether you like them. So the guy decided to trace, what do women like? How old are the men that women like based on the women's ages? So on the diagonal, you've got women's ages, and the red letters show the ages of the men that the women like at different ages. And you can see what women like pretty strongly parallels their own age. So as women get older, they tend to like men who are older. You can see as women get into their 40s and near 50 at the bottom, they like younger men a little bit more. That's natural. But for the most part, it's parallel. Take a guess at what the men one looks like. So, yes, not a surprise. And kudos to the 45-year-old men who are willing to look at women as old as 24. Congratulations to them. But these are people who don't realize that their likes are being observed, right? When we don't know other people are looking, this is what we look like. So, this is what men like. This is what men say they want. See the gray and how the gray sort of parallels men's age as men get older. What they say they want gets older too. It still skews young. There's more gray on the younger side of the actual men's age than on the older side, but it covers their age and even goes beyond their age at all age levels, right? So when they're asked specifically, well, what are you looking for? What do you like? People about my age. Okay, what do they like? What do they say they like? What do they do? Those ages are the ages of the women that men actually contact. And there's a really interesting, highly disturbing pattern that goes on. First, men never contact women older than them, on average. It's all younger women. Second, you see how there's jumps? The jumps correspond with men's ages. So, see there's a pattern at 30s. The men who say that the men who are contacting women who are 30 years old on average, that begins when men are 37 and continues until men are 40 years old. And then it jumps to 41-year-old men and older contacting women who are 35, not 30. There's 2 reasons this could be. The 41-year-old men are saying, I really want a woman who's a little bit older and has more in common with me, or they're saying, I have no shot with a 30-year-old woman, let me try the 35-year-old women. And it's probably the latter, because that pattern repeats itself. Once men get about 10 years older than the women, they're like, I got no shot with a woman that much younger than me, let me go to the next age group. So what we say, what we do are very different. And we need to keep that in mind when we're doing our own research. Let's look at what people do in addition to what they say. Okay. Limitations of self-report research and achievement outcomes. These are well known and we all know them, but sometimes we ignore them in our research because it's just so convenient to be able to ask people things. But there really needs to be some caution in trusting what people tell us, because what they say and what they do are so often different. There's also some weird effects that we're starting to observe in research. One is fade-out effects, where something that had a big effect when we were studying it, when we go back and look 5 years later, the effect is no longer there. And there's also difficulty in replicating a lot of our research. So we have some troubles that we need to take seriously in our research. I think one strategy for observing behavior is to look at big data. And we're in sort of an unprecedented age when we're collecting data, or the ability to collect data sort of surreptitiously and cheaply has increased. And so we can really use that to our advantage to see how are people behaving within certain programs or websites, and we can collect that data and take a look. The OkCupid example, the graphs that I showed, that's one example of that. There's another one called Alt School. This is a new school that's opened up in San Francisco, and it is like a startup school. They get funding from Silicon Valley, and what they're doing is all of the students are doing all of their work on, well, not all of their work, but they're tracking all of their work on iPads, and then every classroom has multiple cameras, and they film everything. And then they go through these videos with the teachers, and they look for disruption points. When did the students stop listening to you? When did the students seem like they perked up and started to pay attention? So they're just trying to solve this problem by collecting massive amounts of data and then mining it. Suggestion number 2, pay attention to the atypical. We love the mean, and sometimes we forget that correlations and regressions are still just the means. They're average tendencies, average trends. Person-centered analyses often are still looking at means. They're clustered, but it's still the means of a cluster. And randomized control trials have not reduced our reliance on the means. We're still looking at, on average, did this treatment have an effect? That's important information. I don't want to discount that, but it's not the only important information. So one suggestion for future research is that we pay attention to the atypical, that we look for those who deviate from the average, that we look at the group that didn't seem to benefit from the treatment in a randomized control trial and see what's going on, that we look for the atypical response or the disruption response or something that doesn't fit the pattern. I know this is very difficult to see. Oh no, it's not that bad. There's something called Khan Academy, where students go online and they watch videos of lessons, and then they can do a bunch of work problems. And it's been criticized because the lessons aren't very interesting and it's fairly didactic. But one of the things that it does, this is my son's data as he was working on whole number line problems. And it just presents problems, and then it records how many they get correct in a row, but it also records how long it takes them to work on the problems. And what you can see there is problems 1, 2, and 3, he's just like, yeah, that's easy, easy, easy. And then he got to problem 4, and something happened. I wasn't even there. But I went back and I looked at this, and I said, oh, what's going on in problem number 4? Let me hone in on that, the disruption, the atypical part of the pattern. And I checked with him, and it turned out that that's when he just decided to space out. He wasn't having difficulty with the problem. He just paid attention to a moth or something. I don't know. But it's a way that we can use data to go in and delve at something a little bit more atypical from the pattern, something that varies from the pattern. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. 3 ideas for the future. let's take a look at what people do. Let's take advantage of some of the newer data collection processes that we have, and let's pay attention to the atypical. Thank you.
So thank you, Tim. So Gail Sinatra is our last panelist here. Yes. Okay. This is yours. Yes. Okay, here you go.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of the panel. I am painfully aware that I stand between you and lunch. So I'm going to be very, very quick. So I knew that I could not possibly top this group in regards to directions for the future. So instead, I took a different tact, and that is I'm going to comment on themes that I noticed through the conference. And this is a completely non-systematic qualitative analysis with absolutely no reliability or validity. It's just my own impressions. So here are the top 10 themes that I noticed this week. The number 10, achievement measures are bad. So this was a persistent theme that was brought up across a number of sessions, and I think that it's really great that we are beginning to really be concerned with this and think about it, but I'm going to return to this theme later. Interventions are good. So I think what we're doing is we are shifting, and I see this over the course of many years now, towards just correlating to achievement measures that aren't very good, and now towards really trying to make an impact in schools. And we see that with many of the panelists' work, and of course many of your own work that you presented here at the conference. So I'm very excited that we have shifted to intervention work. I believe that's of value, so I agree that that's good. Number 8, we see that the concept of engagement needs work. I think it's true with all of our constructs, but even achievement goals, as Reinhard mentioned, is something is agreed upon as that. It still has some fuzzies in the interpretation. But as we go towards looking at different constructs, many of them still need a lot more work, and engagement we saw is one that does. I was excited, number 7, in disengagement. I was excited to see there's conversations around disengagement, as it was pointed out, that this is not exactly the same, of course, as not being engaged, and so I'm really interested in that, and what are students doing when they are disengaged with the task? Because of course they're not disengaged, they're just engaged in something else, and so I'm happy to see that we are exploring more about the flip side of engagement. All through the week, across the panelists here and your own presentations, we've seen so much about how we've diversified our measures beyond self-report, and we're all using a variety of different measures and triangulating them. That's obviously a very positive and good theme. Number 5, emotions. I just wanted to comment, and picking up on what Reinhard just said about the last 20 years of the proliferation of emotions research. I just wanted to comment on this one because I was pleased to be a keynote speaker at ICM many years ago in Turku, and that was when we overlapped with the conceptual change SIG, and I don't know if any of you were there at that meeting, but at that meeting I talked about emotions and motivation and conceptual change, and it was like all new, which was just a really interesting thing. And then this summer, in addition to attending ICM, I also attended 2 other European conferences, which was awesome to spend that much time in Europe. And I was at SIG2, the text and graphic processing in Geneva. And what was really striking, I was also at CASTLE, which was the Society for Text and Discourse. So what was really striking at those 2 text and graphic processing conferences was the work on emotion and motivation. And that's very different. We have not been seeing that, despite, Alan pointed out, of course, John Guthrie's amazing work on motivation in reading. In the text processing, adult text processing or high school kid text processing literature, that hasn't been so prevalent. So we go from many years ago not having much of an emphasis on emotion outside of our group in ICM to now seeing it everywhere. So I'm excited about that, which is a positive activating emotion. Next, number 4, action. I think this was really a huge theme at the conference. We're really getting into that. I mean, I think Anne is talking about that, and Julie was talking about that. And then, of course, Tim just brought it up in a unique and disturbing way, that we need to look at what it is that people actually are doing, and I think we are doing that. We're not just looking at outcomes. We're looking at the process. We're looking at engagement in action. We're looking at how interest plays itself out in a science learning environment, and I think that's exciting. Number 3, we're seeing so much more, I think, on the development of motivations and emotions, the development of interest, where that's really a theme I'm seeing everywhere, and of course, much more over the course of the last several years, and of course the week, on individual differences and honing in, as we panelists have already said, about a particular student and their particular motivation in that particular context with that particular teacher. Number 2, so non-cognitive factors are in. What are non-cognitive factors? It's what we do in ICM. This is a stupid, silly term, but American policymakers love it. So non-cognitive factors are emotion and motivation constructs, and I had the pleasure of being the keynote speaker at the National Academy of Sciences in the fall. And I was really stunned. It was not the National Academy of Ed, it was National Academy of Sciences. I was like, why do they want me there? It turns out they have a really deep interest, and this is the funders in the United States, so people like the NSF, many funders, basically all funders in the audience, hoping some of them will now give me some money, but they are enamored with what they call, this horrible term, non-cognitive factors, but they really do mean the constructs that we study at ICM. So that is the good news, that there's this proliferation of interest that has spread far beyond us. And when you see what people are talking about in the other fields, they're very excited. That's the good news. The bad news is they don't understand what these are. For, using the name non-cognitive, of course, is the first evidence of that. Of course, it's not non-cognitive. Like, imagine goals being non-cognitive. It's sort of silly. So obviously, they don't understand it, so that's a problem. They also think they're easy to measure, and they want some, easy, clear measure. Like, just send me your measure of engagement. Like, there's a measure. Like, they have this sense that it's like measuring height and weight. Like, you just really easy. That's the problem. So it's difficult for them to understand that these constructs aren't that easy to define and they aren't that easy to measure. So that's the downside. But the upside is that they are extremely excited about it, and so your work is in a place that's very good and people are very interested in it. And then last, returning to achievement measures are bad. I'm in a policy program. I brought this up the other day. All policy people care about is achievement. That's it. That's all they care about. And they use all those measures. All the measures that we said aren't very good. And so would encourage you to keep in mind that if we are going to impact policy, that we really do need to continue to look at achievement. And I'm certainly happy for us to think of new ways to do that. That would be great. But the policymakers in the US, at least, are pretty enamored with the idea of standardized achievement tests that they can put into these fancy models. Also, another thing to keep in mind is the policymakers, like the funders, they've heard about grit. They like that one because they understand that's a word in English that people understand what it means, and it's this simple little scale. So they like that. So they get enamored with these ideas, but they don't really understand the psychology underneath emotions and motivations. And so it's good that we are doing all this work. Ευχαριστώ.
So thank you very much, Gail. I'd like to thank all our panelists. They said where we are now and where we have to move forward. So I think we have some time for discussion with the audience. So please, if you have any comments or questions to our panelists, go on. Questions, comments? Yes, please.
Well, thanks very much for these very important recommendations of what we could do or should do. I was wondering, and I'm very happy to see a lot of overlap. So it's not so diverse, so we can actually address things. I was wondering how, what you think about how can we actually motivate ourselves to do that? I mean, how can we, do we need to change some sort of incentive structures, or why is it not happening? Do we need to change any incentive structures, or how can we motivate ourselves to actually, or the community to do that? Like paying more attention to context, or working with practitioners, and so forth.
Yes, it's incentive structures. So it's true that it's difficult. Like, was it Deborah the other day that said, don't do classroom-based research until you get tenure? And I understand that as a former dean, why she said that, but I think it horrified a few people sitting around me. So on the one hand, it makes sense for the individual to worry about, you know, the kind of research they can do quickly and get published so they can get tenure. But on the other hand, of course, we are encouraging everyone to do the kind of work that Anne and Julie do, which is extensive, time-intensive, and in classrooms. And so I think it is the incentive structure that is a challenge for us in our work.
I just would add to that, in addition to the incentive structure, it's often more difficult, complex, time-consuming work to try and figure out what to look at in the context and how that dynamic process is influencing student motivation and achievement is more difficult often than conducting an experiment or collecting survey data.
Okay, all right. Either way. So my idea is that actually not everybody needs to do classroom work. You know, you were a teacher before, right? I was a teacher. I mean, you know, some of us actually come from teaching, and so I'm very interested in bridging research and practice. Julie has been. There are a number of us in the audience that all fit that. And I don't think everybody needs to do it, but I actually think that as people do research, looking for data sources that can complement what you're doing, you know, and for those of us that are doing stuff that's more practice-based, to make sure that we're responsible to the literature more generally. You know, I think that if we talk about this as a community, none of us can do everything, you know, and there are ways forward that would allow for complementarity of research findings or, you know, of concerns, you know, like I'm not seeing this in practice, but I do see this here. And, you know, rather than just going into randomized controlled trials without actually knowing what the variable is that you might be asking questions about, you know, or not having enough information about it. I think that piece of it is what is really being suggested here. I don't really think it's about everybody having to do practice, but I think we can learn from each other. Yeah.
I would fully agree with Anne. So I think it is tremendously important that we produce findings, both basic findings and applicable findings that are consistent, that are cumulative, that use a clear and precise language to communicate with practitioners, and then also to make it possible for them to implement principles in their classrooms. So we should not forget that we are at present not really yet doing a very good job in basic research either. We need better research, and we need more consistency. And we need, I mean, I guess I wouldn't need to talk about the replicability crisis that at present is discussed in social and personality psychology and also in other disciplines, like, for example, clinical medicine. This crisis is also a crisis of educational research. So we need to do better methodologically and substantively. I mean, in early phases of one's career, I would fully agree, it makes sense to first focus on foundational issues and to look into possible applications later.
I don't think so. I think they've said it.
So, any other question?
Could I comment on the other side of that incentive structure? So
yeah, please.
It's not only our incentive structure, but it's what the incentive structure is for the educational system itself. So for many teachers, principals, administrators, our research not very meaningful, even when it probably is, and it's really hard to get them to go along with it, even if maybe it's going to help out, because they have many other issues that they're dealing with, and research often isn't a part of that. So we can do everything on our end to change some things, but we really need to think about how, especially at the administrative level, we can help people understand that some of the things we're doing does make a difference, and then be able to work with the teachers. So I think we really would like that, but they're so busy, well, I can't give you 5 minutes to do this because I got to get the next test go around. So there's incentives on both ends that we really need to think about.
Good job.
Any other comment, question? Yes, Susan.
Yes, yes, good. I can never tell. Closer, closer. Thank you. Come closer, yes. Just to follow up on Alan's comment, I think that one of the things that we discovered, we were doing design-based implementation research, and one of the things that we found as we worked with various different school districts was some school districts jumped up and took us up on it and kind of provided time for teachers to work on it and were very supportive, and other districts were kind of like, yeah, you can come in and do it. I guess well, maybe not this year, maybe, yeah, right? And I was talking to Bill Pennywell about this problem, and he said, well, have you noticed that I was telling him about the different school districts, and he said, have you noticed that it's when your project looks like it's going to help them do something they already want to do that they take you up on it? And sure enough, it's when our project was giving them tools to do something they'd already identified as a need, then they were interested. But it's when we say, hey, can I come and tell you about how you're doing things wrong? And I mean, it seems obvious, but it wasn't to us, because we thought, well, everybody would be interested in this thing that we're talking about. But in fact, that alignment of your particular research project and their particular felt needs is really critical in getting take-up from, not only from the teachers, but take-up from the administrators and the systems that have to support the teachers in finding time to do the extra work.
So we're collaborating, not disseminating.
Well, what's actually neat about that is that you are collaborating and you are disseminating, right? So by working alongside a person, you're in a position to sort of support them to think about what the sort of next options might be. And as I said before, I mean, you can find out what the questions are that need to be answered and answer your own questions as well. I mean, that's one of the things that I've sort of learned, and it's actually very interesting. And it sort of pulls you in one way or another, or into one discipline or another, but it really doesn't get you off track in terms of sort of forward movement in your own work. I think you sort of also need to have a leap of faith there that, like, in fact, it's going to work.
The issue of bridging theory research and applied settings, the educational system, even the administration seems to be a very challenging one, I think, internationally, and we have to work towards this, how to translate or be closer to the applied settings. So thank you. Any other question, comments? Something that you would like to say? Lunch. Lunch. Time for lunch. Enjoy the last lunch of the